In the Incredibles franchise, they have given us quite interesting villains with a lore that I dare say if Disney were not afraid of success, it would have a rather extensive cinematic universe. But today I want to analyze the two villains from both movies because one is quite memorable while the other is somewhat to a certain extent forgettable and heavily criticized. Dan Deavor versus Van Dash. Both have their motivations for wanting to eliminate the supers, but before delving into both, remember to leave me your requests in the comments. And no, it's not because she's a woman. Syndrome is one of the most memorable villains in animated cinema, not only for his striking visual design style, but for the way his story is constructed. The character embodies a mix of intelligence, resentment, and cruelty, making him a unique figure within the story of his universe, which at first glance seems to transform into a carefully structured plan that shows how far someone can go when they turn frustration into hatred. Nana Auluta. One of the characteristics that make him stand out is Project Kronos, the secret plan he invested years of his life in to perfect the ultimate weapon, the Omnidroid. This machine not only represented the depth of his technological genius but also the link to his revenge. Think about how it was from Mr.'s perspective. Aikman Asi.
Incredible when he found out about the Kronos project. It would be something like that.
What's happening?
Mr. Incredible doesn't return calls. Ha 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 ha.
The way his resentment is born is his emotional wound. As a child, he was an absolute fan of Mr. Incredible, dreaming of being a partner and sharing his adventures. But after being rejected, that fervor turned into rancor. Instead of channeling that energy to, I don't know, improve himself or show that he could,
From being a hero, although seriously, he could have been one if he were very intelligent. By his own merit, he obviously chooses the path to revenge. This transition from admiration to hatred is interesting because it shows how a wounded heart can lead to the creation of a memorable villain. What was once illusion turned into a sepsis, and what began as a desire for recognition ended up being a project of extermination. Arrogance also plays an interesting role in the construction, as he always presented himself as a misunderstood genius who is above others, from heroes to ordinary people.
His way of speaking and acting reveals, to a certain extent, an ego of man convinced that glory is his rightful due.
It is arrogance. It is reflected in every aspect of his plan, from the design of his weapons to the speech with which he mocks his enemies. He kidnaps the family of his former idol, plays with the protagonist's desperation, and turns each confrontation into a spectacle to inflate his ego. It is an unnecessary cruelty, as it shows what he truly enjoys. It is not the victory itself, but the control. He tries to kidnap his enemy's son as his last resort for revenge against Jack, regardless of the suffering of an innocent child. Imagine how twisted this becomes. That makes the idea that his story is not meant to inspire pity, but to demonstrate how far someone can fall when dominated by ego and resentment.
Someone whose shadow remains long after the movie ends. Also, all the memes they gave us.
I was disappointed. Let's see if this fits you, big guy.
Did you marry Elastigirl?
15 years.
Very big, it's very bad, it's very big.
In the sequel to The Incredibles, one of the successes is the change in animation. It has quite beautiful details, but if we can talk about something negative, it's the villain. It is quite forgotten. You see, Evelyn was introduced as the mastermind behind the screen-slaver entity, the central antagonist of The Incredibles 2. At first glance, her setup seemed interesting, an intelligent woman, strategist and critic of the role of superheroes in modern society. But as the plot progresses, the character development reveals that although the idea had potential, the execution did not fully shape her as a memorable villain. I mean, by analyzing her characteristics in depth, several reasons can be identified that could explain why she couldn't succeed as expected.
The origin is resentment, presented as a quick justification, more as a mere fact than an emotional process. The death of her parents due to reliance on the heroes could have been an interesting trigger, but it is not explored with the necessary depth. That is to say, the audience understands what happened but does not feel the weight of that wound.
A memorable villain needs time for their motivations not to be perceived as a mere pretext. In this case, the reason appears as a line of dialogue, means more than a deep driving force. The twist revealing the true mind behind the abduction on screens happens too late. However, one positive point I have is that the design of this character is quite good, no? It's a shame they didn't make good use of it, because you see, by arriving at an advanced point in the movie, the revelation lacks the emotional impact it could have had if the story had planted clues or built a more solid path of suspicions. Unlike a strong villain who is introduced gradually with a presence felt from early on, here they played a game of guess who the villain is, which didn't work well, as the use of screens and technological analysis is a modern idea, but is it too intangible? You see, Stacy, the viewer perceives the threat as a concept more than a tangible reality, unlike those antagonists who offer certain physical elements and direct consequences. Here, the threat feels distant. It's a lack of impact versus temporal. It's a lack of impact as it diminishes the sense of urgency and real danger. I mean, a memorable villain needs presence.
In this case, this actress, her figure never manages to assert itself strongly. Not even her personality is called more cerebral than expressive, and she lacks the iconic moments that make her a transcendent antagonist.
There are no memorable speeches, not even gestures that imprint that style in the collective memory. This makes their defeat, although logical, not so impactful either, as the character presents a critique of superheroes and society's dependence on them. A point that, in theory, if we think about it, is interesting, but that idea is not developed with enough consistency. The discourse comes across more as a whim than as a worldview. And you might say, but man, Syndrome also has a whim, but here they didn't work on it a bit darker, since it's a since this creates some contradiction. While we can see that he claims to fight for a just ideal, his actions show that it all comes down to personal resentment. The lack of ideological coherence weakens his credibility. Although he manages to manipulate several characters through mind control, the consequences of his actions are not felt, not lasting at all. The damage it causes disappears with the end of its plan, which leads to the magnitude of its threat. A memorable villain leaves scars, moments that change the course of history. In this case, what happens is perceived more as a temporary obstacle, like a thread that alters the truth from the point handled here. The confrontation with it is not loaded with direct emotional turmoil. There is no intimate connection that makes the clash between heroes and the villain feel inevitable. And unfortunately, the character cannot manage to leave a mark on the Incredibles because his plan, although sophisticated, does not leave damaging images. That means a villain like Syndrome in the first installment, who did manage to make an impact with very dark elements like the Project Kronos, the elimination of supers with the Omnidroids, and even the cruelty we see in his plans. It is a difference in which what causes confusion within the story marks such an evident contrast. Of course, the villain is presented as a strategic mind, but I dare say she lacks the mix of vulnerability and brutality that usually define an unforgettable antagonist. Being excessively cerebral, unfortunately, he or she does not show moments of humanity that deepen her character, nor scenes of extreme cruelty that generate fear. It is an excessive coldness that makes her a more easily forgettable character. It is impossible to talk about Gaia without remembering that in the end she did not resonate. The character had attractive initial elements. We have the same intelligence, perhaps social critique, and a personal background that could offer depth, but the execution in the story did not allow her to do well as a memorable villain. Her motivation feels superficial, her actions lack lasting consequences, and her presence never becomes truly iconic.
I even dare to say that the Underground could have worked better as the main villain in the sequel, but what do you think about this?
For these aspects, both can end up being compared, but you can leave your point of view. I invite you to watch more of my videos. I know you will love them.
Come on, what are you waiting for?